This baby communicates through bear sense. His language is wild and pure. The morning mist hung low over the pine trees, creating a white blanket that seemed to muffle every sound in the valley. Ethan Marshall stood at the window of their cabin, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on something in the tree line, something that shouldn't have been there. For 3 days now, the same shadow had appeared at exactly the same time, just as the sun touched the highest branches of the old oak tree. It wasn't moving, wasn't threatening, just watching. Lily Morgan, his wife, was in the nursery with their 3-month-old son Connor, humming a soft melody that drifted through the wooden walls like a gentle breeze. They had moved to this remote cabin in the mountains 2 months ago, seeking peace and quiet for their newborn, away from the chaos of city life. The decision had felt right at the time, but now, with that shadow lingering at the edge of their property, Ethan wasn't so sure anymore. The first time he noticed something unusual wasn't the shadow, though. It was the smell. 3 nights ago, Connor had been crying, that piercing wail that all new parents know too well, the one that cuts through sleep like a knife through butter. Ethan had stumbled out of bed, his feet finding the cold wooden floor, and made his way to the nursery. But as he approached the door, the crying stopped, replaced by something else entirely. A scent filled the hallway, sweet like honey, but mixed with something earthier, like fresh pine needles after rain. It was coming from Connor's room. When he pushed open the door, he found Lily already there, standing over the crib with an expression he had never seen on her face before. She was smiling, but there were tears in her eyes, and she was breathing deeply, as if trying to memorize the smell. Connor was awake, his tiny hands reaching up toward nothing in particular, and that scent, that impossible, beautiful scent, was definitely coming from him. They didn't talk about it that first night. Maybe they were both too tired, or maybe they were afraid that speaking about it would make it disappear. But the next morning, over breakfast, Lily finally broke the silence. She told Ethan that she had noticed it before, just hints of it when Connor was particularly happy or content. The smell would change, she said, becoming sharper when he was hungry, softer when he was sleepy, and sometimes, when he was looking at them with those big blue eyes, it would smell like vanilla and cinnamon, like the cookies her grandmother used to make. Ethan had thought she was imagining things, maybe some kind of postpartum sensitivity to smells, but then he started noticing it too. The scents were subtle at first, barely there, like catching a whiff of perfume from someone who passed by hours ago, but they grew stronger each day, more distinct, more purposeful. It was on the 3rd day that the bear appeared. Ethan had been outside, checking the generator that powered their cabin, when he saw it for the first time. A massive, brown bear, easily 8 feet tall when standing, was sitting at the edge of the forest, maybe 50 yards from the house. His first instinct was panic. They had a baby in the house, and bears were dangerous, everyone knew that. But something about the way it was sitting, so still, so patient, made him pause. The bear wasn't looking at him. Its eyes were fixed on the cabin, specifically on the window of Connor's nursery. Ethan's hand went to the rifle they kept by the door, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he watched the bear watching his house, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the bear stood up, turned around, and walked back into the forest. That evening, as they were putting Connor to bed, the scent was stronger than ever. It filled the entire cabin, a mixture of wildflowers and morning dew that made them both stop and close their eyes. Connor was gurgling happily in his crib, his little feet kicking at the air, and outside through the window they could see the bear had returned. This time, Lily saw it too. She grabbed Ethan's arm, her fingers digging into his skin, but like him, she didn't seem afraid. The bear was just sitting there, its massive head tilted slightly, as if it was listening to something, or smelling something. The realization hit them both at the same time. The bear could smell Connor's scents. It was drawn to them, not in a predatory way, but in something that looked almost like wonder. Over the next few days, a routine developed. The bear would appear every morning and evening, always maintaining the same respectful distance, never coming closer to the house. And Connor's scents grew more complex, more nuanced. When he was excited, the cabin would fill with the smell of fresh strawberries and mint. When he was upset, it was more like wet earth and fallen leaves. Lily started keeping a journal, trying to map the scents to Connor's moods, creating a dictionary of sorts for their son's unusual gift. She wrote down everything, the time of day, what Connor had been doing, what the scent reminded her of. Reading through her notes was like reading poetry, each entry a small window into their baby's emotional world. The bears started multiplying. First, it was just the one, the big brown male that had appeared first. But soon, a smaller female joined him, and then another, younger bear that might have been their cub. They would sit in a semicircle at the forest's edge, all facing the cabin, all perfectly still. The strange thing was, Ethan and Lily stopped being afraid. There was something so peaceful about the bear's presence, so non-threatening, that it became part of their daily routine. They would have their morning coffee while watching the bears, and the bears would sit there, seemingly content just to be near whatever Connor was broadcasting into the world. One particularly memorable evening, Connor had been fussy all day. Nothing seemed to soothe him, not feeding, not rocking, not singing. The scents coming from him were chaotic, shifting rapidly from one to another like a radio scanning through stations. Then, suddenly, everything changed. A new scent filled the room, one they had never experienced before. It was like the essence of the forest itself had been distilled into pure fragrance, pine and moss, and wildflowers and rain all at once. Connor stopped crying immediately, his eyes wide open, staring at something beyond the ceiling. Outside, every single bear in the forest seemed to have gathered. There must have been a dozen of them, all sitting in perfect silence, and for the first time, they saw one of the bears close its eyes, as if the scent was so beautiful it needed to shut out all other senses to fully appreciate it. Ethan started leaving the windows open, despite the cool mountain air. It felt wrong somehow to trap Connor's scents inside, like keeping a bird in a cage. The bears never tried to come closer, never showed any sign of aggression. If anything, they seemed protective. Once, when a group of hikers passed too close to the cabin, the bears stood up, forming a barrier between the strangers and the house. The hikers, understandably terrified, quickly changed their route. But the bears didn't chase them, didn't growl or charge. They simply stood there until the hikers were gone, then settled back into their usual positions. The local mail carrier, an old man named Frank, who had been delivering mail in these mountains for 40 years, was the first outsider to notice something unusual. He mentioned to Ethan that he had never seen so many bears in one area without them fighting over territory. When Ethan tried to explain, Frank just laughed and said he had seen stranger things in these mountains. But he started lingering a bit longer during his deliveries, always asking about Connor, always sniffing the air with a curious expression. One day, he brought them a package along with an old, leather-bound book. He said he had found it in an estate sale, and something about it reminded him of their situation. The book was a diary, its pages yellow with age, the ink faded but still readable. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret who had lived in this very cabin 60 years ago. As Lily read through it, her hands started shaking. Margaret wrote about her daughter, Emma, who had been born with the same gift. She described the scents, the bears, the peaceful coexistence that had developed. But there was more. Margaret wrote about how Emma's gift had evolved as she grew older, how she had learned to control it, to communicate deliberately through scent. She wrote about conversations, actual conversations, between Emma and the bears, exchanges of information that transcended species. The diary entries became more fantastic as they progressed, describing how Emma could understand the health of the forest through the bear's scents, how she could sense approaching storms days in advance, how she became a bridge between the human and animal worlds. But the most extraordinary entry was near the end. Margaret wrote about the day Emma decided to leave, not because she had to, but because she wanted to explore what else was possible with her gift. She was 17 years old, and she walked into the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back. The bears went with her. Margaret never saw her daughter again, but she wasn't sad. She wrote that she could still smell Emma's happiness on the wind sometimes, carried down from the high mountains where even humans rarely ventured. The last entry was simple, just a single line that said the gift would return to the valley when it was needed again. Lily closed the diary and looked at Connor, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just some random occurrence, some freak of nature. This was something deeper, older, part of the fabric of this place. She shared the diary with Ethan that night, and they sat up until dawn discussing what it meant. Were they supposed to raise Connor here in isolation, letting his gift develop naturally? Or should they try to give him a normal life, suppress this ability somehow? The thought of suppressing it felt wrong, like trying to stop a river from flowing. But the thought of their son walking into the forest one day and never coming back was equally terrifying. As if sensing their distress, Connor's scents that night were soothing, lavender and chamomile, the smell of comfort and reassurance. The bears outside seemed to respond to it too, settling down into what looked like sleep, though their ears still twitched at every sound. Ethan and Lily made a decision then, without speaking it aloud. They would stay. They would let this play out naturally, document everything, and trust that whatever force had brought them here knew what it was doing. They would be the guardians of this gift, the protectors of this bridge between worlds, at least until Connor was old enough to decide for himself what he wanted to do with it. The next morning brought a surprise. When Ethan went outside to check the mail, he found something at the door. A smooth river stone, perfectly round, still wet from the stream. There were no footprints, no sign of who or what had left it. But when he brought it inside and placed it near Connor's crib, the baby reached for it immediately, and the cabin filled with a scent like sunshine on water, pure joy distilled into fragrance. Outside, the bears were closer than they had ever been, just at the edge of the porch, and for the first time, Ethan saw one of them make a sound, a soft huffing that sounded almost like laughter. Days turned into weeks, and the gifts continued. Sometimes it was berries, perfectly ripe and sweeter than anything they could buy in stores. Sometimes it was flowers, unusual ones that Lily couldn't identify in any of her botanical books. Once, it was a feather from an eagle. Another time, a piece of honeycomb still dripping with golden honey. Each gift seemed to correspond to something Connor had communicated through scent the day before. When he had been particularly happy, playing with a new toy, the bears brought things that were playful, like a pine cone that rattled with seeds. When he had been calm and contemplative, staring at the clouds through the window, they brought things that were beautiful and serene, like a piece of quartz that caught the light in rainbow patterns. Lily's journal grew thick with entries. She had developed a classification system, categorizing the scents by emotion, intensity, and what she called intentionality. She noticed that Connor's scents were becoming more deliberate, less random. When he was hungry, the scent was always the same now, a specific combination of bread and butter that was impossible to misinterpret. When he wanted to be held, it was the smell of clean laundry and sunshine. He was developing a vocabulary, a consistent language of scent that they were all learning together. Even Ethan, who had always claimed to have a poor sense of smell, could now distinguish between dozens of Connor's different scent communications. The bears, too, seemed to be learning. They had begun to respond more specifically to different scents. When Connor produced his playful scent, the younger bears would wrestle with each other, putting on a show that made the baby giggle. When he produced his sleepy scent, they would all lie down, creating a living carpet of fur at the forest's edge. It was like watching a conductor lead an orchestra, except the conductor was a baby, and the orchestra was a group of wild bears. The harmony of it was beautiful and slightly surreal. One afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Connor had been watching the bears through the window, his little hands pressed against the glass. Suddenly, a new scent filled the room, one that Lily had never catalogued before. It was questioning, curious, like the smell of rain before it falls, full of potential. Outside, the largest bear stood up on its hind legs, and then, impossibly, it produced a scent of its own. Ethan and Lily both smelled it at the same time, a deep, earthy musk mixed with something sweeter, like berries and sunshine. Connor responded immediately, his scent changing to match and complement the bears, creating a harmony of fragrances that made both parents stop whatever they were doing and just breathe. This was it. This was actual communication, a real exchange of information through scent. Connor, their 3-month-old baby, was having a conversation with a wild bear. The science of it, the biology, the evolutionary impossibility, none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the pure magic of watching their son bridge a gap that humans had been trying to cross for millennia. The bear lowered itself back to all fours, huffed once in what seemed like satisfaction, and returned to its usual spot. But something had changed. A door had been opened, a connection established that went beyond mere observation. The conversations became more frequent after that. Connor would wake up in the morning and immediately produce a greeting scent, something bright and cheerful like orange blossoms. The bears would respond with their own morning scents, each one unique, each one telling a story of where they had been, what they had seen. Lily tried to decode these scents, writing down her interpretations, but she knew she was only catching fragments of the full conversation. It was like trying to understand a symphony by only hearing the violin section. Still, she persisted, filling notebook after notebook with observations, theories, and questions. Ethan built a covered porch area where they could sit with Connor even on rainy days, keeping the windows open so the scents could travel freely. The bears seemed to appreciate this, often coming closer during storms, sharing the shelter in their own way, always maintaining that respectful distance, but clearly feeling more comfortable with the family's presence. On one particularly stormy night, when thunder shook the cabin and lightning split the sky, Connor's scents were calm and soothing, like a lullaby in fragrance form. The bears huddled together, and Ethan could swear he saw the younger ones looking toward the cabin with something like gratitude. Frank, the mail carrier, started bringing other people by, always asking permission first, always respectful of the family's privacy. There was a professor from the university who specialized in animal behavior. a Native American elder who said his grandmother had told stories about children who could speak to animals, a perfumer from France who nearly wept when she experienced Connor's scent language for the first time. Each visitor brought their own perspective, their own theories, but none of them could fully explain what was happening. The consensus seemed to be that they were witnessing something unprecedented, or at least undocumented in modern science. The Native American elder, a man named Joseph, spent the longest time with them. He told them stories from his tribe about the first humans, who could communicate with all living things before they forgot how to listen. He said Connor was remembering something humanity had lost, that he was a bridge back to an older way of being in the world. Joseph taught them to see the bears not as wild animals to be feared, but as neighbors, as part of the extended family of the valley. He showed them how to leave offerings, not to appease or control, but to honor the relationship that was developing. Under his guidance, they began to understand that what was happening with Connor wasn't just about communication, it was about communion, about remembering that all life is interconnected. As Connor grew stronger, his sense grew more complex. By 6 months old, he could produce layered fragrances that told stories. Lily documented one that she called the Day's Adventure, a scent that started with morning dew, progressed through sunshine and grass, included a note of brief rain, and ended with the cozy warmth of evening fires. The bears would respond with their own stories, and sometimes if you paid close attention you could almost follow the narrative. A hunt, a discovery of a new berry patch, an encounter with deer at the river. The most profound moment came on a clear winter morning, when the first snow of the season began to fall. Connor was 7 months old then, sitting up on his own, his eyes bright with intelligence that seemed beyond his age. As the snowflakes drifted down, he produced a scent that was entirely new, something that smelled like wonder itself, if wonder had a fragrance. It was crystalline and pure, with notes of pine and peppermint, but also something indefinable, something that made everyone who smelled it stop and remember what it felt like to see snow for the first time as a child. The bears stood up, all of them, and for the first time, they moved closer to the cabin, forming a complete circle around it. They weren't threatening, weren't aggressive, they were participating in something, some ritual or celebration that transcended species. Connor laughed, that pure baby laugh that sounds like joy distilled, and his scent shifted, becoming warm and inviting, like hot chocolate and cinnamon. The bears began to move, not quite dancing, but swaying slightly, their massive bodies creating patterns in the falling snow. Ethan and Lily stood at the window, holding each other, tears streaming down their faces, witnesses to something sacred and ancient and absolutely impossible. That night, after the bears had returned to the forest and Connor was asleep, Ethan and Lily sat by the fire and talked about the future. They knew that Connor's gift would only grow stronger, that the communication would become more sophisticated. They wondered if he would retain the ability to speak with humans normally, or if scent would become his primary language. They worried about school, about society, about how to protect him from those who might want to study him or exploit his gift. But mostly, they felt grateful. Grateful to be part of this mystery. Grateful to witness this bridge between worlds. Grateful that their son had been chosen, or had chosen, to carry this ancient gift into the modern world. The Diary of Margaret became their guide. They read and reread her entries, looking for clues about what to expect. She had written about Emma's teenage years, how the gift had evolved to include not just bears, but all animals, how birds would land on her shoulders, how deer would walk beside her, how even insects seemed to respond to her scent communications. But she also wrote about the challenges, the isolation, the difficulty of living between two worlds. Emma had struggled to connect with other humans, finding their communication limited and frustrating compared to the rich, immediate truth of scent. Margaret had worried about her daughter's future, about love, about children of her own. But there was hope in the diary, too. Margaret wrote about the joy Emma found in her gift, the purpose she felt in being a translator between species. She wrote about the knowledge Emma gained from the animals, about weather patterns and seasonal changes, about which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous, about the health of the ecosystem and the delicate balance that kept it thriving. Emma had become something more than human, but not less than human, an evolution rather than an aberration. And in her final entries, Margaret expressed her belief that Emma's children, wherever they were, would carry the gift forward, that it would never truly leave the valley. As winter deepened, the communication between Connor and the bears became something extraordinary to witness. They had developed what could only be described as inside jokes, scent combinations that would make Connor giggle and cause the younger bears to roll on their backs in what looked like laughter. There were serious conversations, too, usually in the evening, when Connor would produce deep, complex scents that seemed to ask questions, and the older bears would respond with equally complex answers. Lily had given up trying to fully decode these exchanges, accepting that some things were beyond human understanding, at least for now. The gifts from the bears had evolved, too. They were more specific now, more thoughtful. When Connor had been teething, they brought specific plants that, when Lily researched them, turned out to have natural, pain-relieving properties. When he had a cold, they brought pine boughs rich in vitamin C. It was as if they were sharing their forest medicine, their ancient knowledge of healing. Ethan built a special box by the door where the bears could leave their gifts, and every morning, checking it became part of their routine, like checking the mail but far more magical. One day, a mother bear brought her new cub to meet Connor. The cub was tiny, probably only a few weeks old, and the mother held it gently in her mouth, bringing it close enough to the window for Connor to see. Connor's scent that day was unlike anything they had experienced before, tender and protective, like a lullaby made of fragrance. The mother bear responded with her own maternal scent, and for a moment the two mothers, human and bear, shared something profound through their children, an understanding that transcended species, a recognition of the universal nature of maternal love. As spring arrived, bringing with it the smell of new growth and possibility, Ethan and Lily made a decision. They would document everything, not for science or fame, but for Connor. They would create a record of his early years, of the development of his gift, so that when he was older, he could understand his own history. They bought video cameras, audio recorders, and more notebooks. They interviewed each other, describing what they observed, how they felt, what they hoped for. They wanted Connor to know that he was loved, not despite his difference, but because of it, that his gift was exactly that. A gift, not a burden. The professor from the university had offered to study Connor, to bring in teams of scientists to publish papers. They had declined, politely but firmly. This wasn't about proving anything to the world. This was about a child growing up with an extraordinary ability, and that child deserved privacy, deserved to develop at his own pace without the pressure of being a scientific specimen. The professor had understood, had even agreed, saying that some things were too precious to dissect, too magical to reduce to data points. As Connor approached his first birthday, his scent vocabulary had grown to hundreds of distinct fragrances. He could tell complex stories, express subtle emotions, even make requests. When he wanted to go outside, he would produce the scent of fresh air and sunshine. When he was tired, it was warm milk and soft blankets. When he saw something that excited him, it was fireworks and birthday cake, celebration in olfactory form. The bears had learned to interpret most of these scents, responding appropriately, sometimes even anticipating his needs before he expressed them. But perhaps the most remarkable development was that Connor had begun to understand human speech as well. He couldn't speak yet, not with words, but he clearly understood when Ethan and Lily talked to him. He would respond with appropriate sense, creating a bilingual conversation that flowed naturally between verbal and olfactory communication. It was like watching someone translate in real time between two completely different languages, except the translator was a baby, and one of the languages had never been documented before. The night before Connor's first birthday, something extraordinary happened. All day, Connor had been producing anticipatory scents, excitement mixed with something else. Something that smelled like change was coming. The bears had been restless too, pacing at the forest's edge, occasionally standing to look toward the mountains. As the sun set, Connor crawled to the window, something he had just learned to do, and placed his tiny hands on the glass. The scent that emerged from him then was a calling, clear and strong, like a horn sounding across the valley. From the forest came an answer, not from the bears they knew, but from something else. The scent was old, ancient even, carrying notes of deep earth and time itself. Then, from the shadows between the trees, emerged a bear unlike any they had seen. It was massive, its fur silver with age, its eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. This bear approached the cabin slowly, deliberately, each step measured and purposeful. The other bears parted, showing deference to this elder, this keeper of some ancient knowledge. The silver bear stopped just below Connor's window and stood on its hind legs, bringing its face level with the baby's. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and the air filled with a conversation in scent so complex, so layered, that Ethan and Lily could only catch fragments, like hearing snatches of a song in a foreign language. But they understood the essence of it. This was a blessing, a passing of knowledge, a welcome into a tradition older than memory. The silver bear was acknowledging Connor as part of something larger, as a keeper of the bridge between worlds. When the exchange ended, the silver bear lowered itself back to all fours, turned, and walked back into the forest. But before disappearing completely, it stopped and looked back at Ethan and Lily. The scent it produced then was clearly meant for them, gratitude mixed with trust, an acknowledgement of their role as guardians of this gift. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. But the scent lingered, and with it, a sense that something had been settled, some ancient protocol observed, some necessary ritual completed. Connor slept deeply that night, his dreams accompanied by sense of far-off places, mountains higher than clouds, forests deeper than imagination. Ethan and Lily took turns sitting by his crib, watching him sleep, marveling at the journey they had been on in just 1 year. From that first mysterious scent to this moment of recognition by something ancient and wild, they had been witnesses to a story that most people would never believe. But they didn't need anyone else to believe. They had lived it, were living it, would continue to live it as Connor grew and his gift evolved. The next morning, Connor's first birthday, they found the most extraordinary gift yet at their door. It was a piece of amber, ancient and golden, with something preserved inside that looked like a flower, but unlike any flower that existed today. When they brought it inside, it seemed to resonate with Connor's scents, amplifying them, making them richer and more complex. It was as if the bears had given him a tool, something to help him develop his gift further. Connor held the amber in his tiny hands and produced a scent of pure happiness, sunshine and laughter and love all mixed together. Looking back at that first year, Ethan and Lily could hardly believe how much their lives had changed. They had come to the mountains seeking peace and quiet for their new baby, and instead had discovered that their baby was part of something extraordinary, something that connected them to the wild in ways they never could have imagined. They had learned to trust in mystery, to accept that not everything needed to be understood to be appreciated, that sometimes the most profound truths came not through words, but through the subtle language of scent carried on the mountain wind. As they celebrated Connor's birthday with a simple cake, the bears gathered outside in greater numbers than ever before. The air was filled with celebratory scents from both inside and outside the cabin, creating a symphony of joy that seemed to embrace the entire valley. Connor clapped his hands and laughed, his own scent bright and clear, telling the story of a boy who belonged to two worlds and was loved in both. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. But even in that perfection, there was the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Connor would grow, his gift would evolve, and with it would come new challenges, new mysteries, new wonders. The diary of Margaret had hinted at abilities that seemed impossible. Communication not just with animals but with the forest itself, with the mountain, with the very spirit of the wild. Whether Connor would develop these abilities remained to be seen, but Ethan and Lily were ready for whatever came next. They had learned to live with wonder, to accept the impossible, to trust in the ancient wisdom that flowed through their son like breath. That night, as they put Connor to bed, his scent was peaceful and content, like the earth after rain. The bears settled into their positions around the cabin, guardians and witnesses to this ongoing miracle. And in the amber light of the moon, the valley itself seemed to pulse with life, with connection, with the promise that some bridges once built could never be broken. The story of the boy who spoke in scents was just beginning, but already it was clear that it would be a story worth telling, worth living, worth believing in. The weeks following Connor's first birthday brought subtle but significant changes. His scent communications were becoming more intentional, more controlled. Where before his fragrances had been largely emotional responses, now they carried deliberate messages. When he wanted to go outside, he didn't just produce the scent of fresh air. He created a complex bouquet that included the specific area he wanted to visit. The wooden bridge over the creek smelled different from the meadow behind the cabin, and Connor could distinguish between them in his scent language. The bears, too, had begun to teach him their own scent vocabulary. Lily observed what she called lessons, where an older bear would produce a specific scent, then wait for Connor to attempt to replicate it, showing remarkable patience as he learned. One morning, Ethan discovered something that changed their understanding of what was happening. He had been reviewing the video footage they had been recording, trying to create a visual dictionary of Connor's scents and their meanings, when he noticed something odd. In moments when Connor was producing his most complex scents, there was a faint shimmer in the air around him, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but more structured, more purposeful. He showed Lily, and together they watched frame by frame as these shimmer patterns seemed to form shapes, almost like letters in an unknown alphabet, visible only for fractions of seconds. They wondered if Connor wasn't just producing scents, but somehow manipulating the very air itself, creating patterns that carried information beyond what their human senses could fully perceive. The discovery led them back to Margaret's diary, where they found a passage they had previously overlooked. Margaret had written about Emma seeing the scent trails, paths of fragrance that animals left behind that told stories of where they had been, what they had eaten, who they had met. She described Emma following these trails like reading a map, understanding the daily life of the forest through these invisible paths. They wondered if the shimmers they were seeing were Connor beginning to perceive these trails, if his gift was evolving to include not just production of scent, but the ability to see the scent communications of others in a visual form. As if to confirm their theory, Connor began reaching for things that weren't there, or at least weren't visible to Ethan and Lily. His little hands would grasp at the air, following patterns only he could see, and his expression would be one of intense concentration. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly, as if someone had told him a joke, but they were alone in the room. Other times he would produce responding scents to no apparent stimulus, having conversations with invisible participants. It should have been concerning. A baby showing signs of seeing things that weren't there, but given everything else that had happened, they chose to trust that Connor was simply perceiving more of the world than they could. The bears confirmed their suspicions in their own way. They began leaving more complex gifts, things that seemed to tell stories. A collection of stones arranged in a specific pattern, each one from a different part of the forest. A bundle of various plants tied together with grass, each plant meaningful in some way they couldn't quite decipher. Once, they left a piece of bark with claw marks on it that formed a pattern eerily similar to the shimmers Ethan had captured on video. It was as if they were trying to teach Connor, and by extension his parents, a form of writing that predated human language, a way of recording information that combined scent, sight, and touch. Frank, the mail carrier, had become a regular visitor, always bringing news from the outside world and taking away stories of Connor's development. He had become something of a guardian of their secret, deflecting questions from curious locals, delivering supplies so they didn't have to go to town as often. One day, he brought disturbing news. There had been inquiries from a government agency, something about unusual wildlife patterns in the area picked up by satellite surveillance. The concentration of bears around their cabin had been noticed. Frank had told them he knew nothing about it, but he warned Ethan and Lily to be careful, to have a story ready if anyone came asking questions. The warning prompted a family meeting that night. They discussed contingency plans, what they would do if Connor's gift became public knowledge. They couldn't bear the thought of their son becoming a subject of study, poked and prodded by scientists trying to understand something that perhaps wasn't meant to be understood in that way. They decided to reach out to Joseph, the Native American elder who had visited before. He had connections, he had said, people who understood the old ways and would help protect Connor if needed. It felt strange to be thinking in terms of protection when surrounded by bears who had shown nothing but gentleness, but the human world was different, more dangerous in its way than any wild animal. Joseph arrived the next week, bringing with him 2 other elders from different tribes. They sat in the cabin, watching Connor interact with the bears through the window, and their faces showed not surprise but recognition. One of them, a woman named Sarah, spoke of prophecies she had thought were just stories, about children who would be born when the world needed them most, children who could bridge the gap between human and nature that had grown so wide. She said Connor was not the only one, that there were others, scattered across the world, each with their own gift, their own way of communicating with the natural world. The thought was both comforting and overwhelming, knowing Connor wasn't alone, but also realizing they were part of something much larger than they had imagined. The elders performed a ceremony that night, something to protect Connor and strengthen his gift. They burned sage and cedar, sang songs in languages that predated English by thousands of years, and created patterns with colored sand that seemed to shimmer in the same way as Connor's scent communications. Connor watched it all with intense focus, occasionally producing scents that harmonized with the smoke from the burning herbs. The bears gathered closer than ever before, some of them swaying to the rhythm of the songs. When the ceremony ended, there was a feeling of completion, of protection, as if invisible walls had been built around the cabin that would keep out those who meant harm while welcoming those who understood. In the days that followed, Connor's gift took another leap forward. He began producing scents that weren't just communications but seemed to have physical effects. A calming scent that could actually lower heart rates. An energizing scent that made everyone who smelled it feel more alert and alive. Lily documented everything meticulously, noting that these scents seemed to work on a molecular level, actually changing the chemistry of those who experienced them. It was as if Connor had learned to use scent as medicine, as a tool for healing and helping. The implications were staggering. If he could do this at just over a year old, what would he be capable of as he grew? The bears, too, seemed to be evolving in their interactions with Connor. They had begun to coordinate their actions in response to his scents, working together in ways that suggested complex planning and communication. When Connor produced a specific sequence of scents, the bears would disperse into the forest and return with specific items. Different bears, bringing different components that, when combined, created something useful. Once, they assembled materials for a shelter during an approaching storm. Another time, they brought medicinal plants when Lily had a headache, somehow knowing she was in pain even though she had tried to hide it. One particularly remarkable incident occurred when an injured deer stumbled into the clearing near the cabin. It had been attacked by something, probably a mountain lion, and had deep gashes along its flank. Connor, who had been playing on the porch, immediately produced a scent that Lily had never cataloged before. It was complex and layered, combining elements of concern, calling, and something else, something that smelled like intention itself. The bears responded immediately, but not aggressively. Instead, they formed a protective circle around the deer, keeping it calm while one of them, the female they had come to know well, began licking the deer's wounds. Connor continued producing the scent, and incredibly the deer's breathing slowed. Its eyes closed, and it allowed the bears to tend to it. Over the next several hours, Connor maintained what could only be described as a scent vigil, producing waves of healing fragrances that seemed to accelerate the deer's recovery. The bears brought specific plants, crushing them with their paws and applying them to the wounds. By evening, the deer was able to stand, and by the next morning, it walked back into the forest, still limping but clearly on the mend. The entire incident had been like watching an emergency room staffed by bears and directed by a toddler, absurd and miraculous in equal measure. It also suggested that Connor's gift wasn't just about communication, but about coordination, about bringing different species together for a common purpose. As Connor grew more mobile, learning to walk with a determination that matched his unusual gifts, new challenges arose. He wanted to go into the forest, to be closer to the bears, to follow the scent trails he could perceive, but his parents couldn't. Ethan and Lily had to find a balance between protecting him and allowing his gift to develop naturally. They created safe spaces where Connor could interact more directly with the wildlife, always supervised, always with the protective presence of the older bears nearby. These sessions were remarkable to witness. Connor would toddle between massive bears, his tiny hands touching their fur, his scents creating conversations that looked like dancing, each participant moving in response to olfactory cues. The journal Lily kept had grown to multiple volumes, a detailed record of Connor's development that read like something between a scientific study and a fairy tale. She had developed her own ability to detect and interpret scents, though nowhere near Connor's level. She could now identify basic emotions and intentions in the bear's scent communications, could even produce simple scent messages herself, though she likened it to speaking a foreign language with a terrible accent. Ethan, too, had developed these abilities, and they wondered if prolonged exposure to Connor's gift was actually changing them, enhancing their own dormant capabilities. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Connor play with bear cubs under the watchful eyes of their mothers, Ethan raised a question they had both been avoiding. What would happen when Connor reached school age? How could they integrate him into normal society when he was anything but normal? The thought of Connor in a classroom, trying to communicate with children who couldn't understand his primary language, surrounded by artificial scents that would overwhelm his sensitive abilities, was heartbreaking. But the alternative, keeping him isolated from other humans, seemed equally wrong. They needed to find others like Connor, to create a community where he wouldn't be alone. As if the universe was listening to their concerns, Frank arrived the next day with a letter. It had no return address, no postmark, as if it had simply appeared in his mailbag. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant script that simply said, "You are not alone. When the time is right, we will find you." Until then, trust the gift, trust the bears, trust Connor. Enclosed was a pressed flower, one that released a faint scent when they touched it, a scent that made Connor laugh with delight and caused every bear in the vicinity to stand at attention. Someone, somewhere, knew about Connor and was watching, protecting, waiting. The letter changed something in Ethan and Lily's perspective. They stopped worrying so much about the future and focused on the present, on documenting and supporting Connor's gift as it continued to evolve. They began to see themselves not as parents of an unusual child, but as custodians of something precious and important, something that might be crucial for humanity's future relationship with the natural world. Every day brought new wonders, new demonstrations of the possibilities inherent in Connor's abilities, new proof that the boundaries between human and nature were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. As autumn arrived again, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red, Connor spoke his first word. It wasn't mama or dada, but bear, pronounced with perfect clarity while producing a scent that was unmistakably a greeting. The bears responded with their own vocalizations, sounds they had never made before, as if Connor had given them permission to use voice as well as scent. From that day forward, the communication became even richer, combining scent, sound, and gesture in a complex language that was entirely their own. Connor was becoming truly bilingual, or perhaps multilingual, fluent in human speech, scent, and something in between that had no name. The development of speech didn't diminish Connor's scent abilities. If anything, it enhanced them. He could now explain to his parents what he was smelling, could describe the stories the bears were telling, could translate between worlds in a way that made the impossible seem obvious. He told them about the bear who had traveled from 3 valleys over to meet him, drawn by scents carried on the wind. He described the health of the forest as told through the collective scent map created by all its inhabitants. He spoke of things that sounded like poetry, but were simply his direct experience of the world, a world far richer and more interconnected than most humans ever perceived. One night, Connor woke them with urgent scents and sounds. "Fire," he said, though there was no fire visible. Far away, but coming. His scent was sharp, acrid, carrying notes of smoke and fear. The bears were agitated, pacing, looking toward the mountains. Ethan checked the weather reports, the fire services, but found nothing. Still, they trusted Connor and began preparing, clearing brush from around the cabin, filling containers with water. 2 days later, the news reported a forest fire 3 valleys over, driven by unexpected winds in their direction. By then, they were ready, and the bears had already begun creating fire breaks, their coordinated efforts guided by Connor's scent communications. The fire never reached them, turned away by a fortunate change in wind, but the incident had proven something important. Connor's gift wasn't just about communication. It was about connection to a larger network of information, a living system that could sense danger and opportunity far beyond the range of normal perception. He was like a node in a vast network of natural intelligence, able to tap into the collective awareness of the forest and its inhabitants. It was a responsibility as much as a gift, and even at his young age, Connor seemed to understand this. As winter approached once again, bringing with it the promise of snow and quiet contemplation, the family settled into a rhythm that felt both extraordinary and completely natural. Connor would wake each morning and greet the bears with scent and sound, checking on the forest like a guardian making rounds. He would play and learn, his education a mixture of traditional children's books and the living library of the wilderness. He would translate between his parents and the bears, facilitating a relationship that grew deeper and more complex with each passing day. And at night, he would produce lullaby scents that drifted through the cabin and into the forest, songs without words that spoke of peace and connection and the promise of tomorrow. Looking at their son, now a toddler who moved between 2 worlds as easily as breathing, Ethan and Lily no longer wondered if they had made the right choice in staying. This was exactly where they were meant to be, raising a child who might represent the future of human-nature relations, a bridge between worlds that had been separated for too long. The challenges would come, they knew. The outside world would eventually intrude. Connor would have to navigate a society that might not understand or accept his gift. But for now, in this moment, in this valley where bears brought gifts and scents carried stories, everything was as it should be. The amber that the bears had given Connor for his birthday had become his constant companion, always within reach, seeming to pulse with warmth when he held it. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, the preserved flower inside looked like it was blooming. Impossible, but undeniable. It had become a symbol of Connor's gift, ancient yet alive, preserved yet growing, a bridge between what was and what could be. And in the quiet moments, when Connor held the amber and produced his most complex scents, Ethan and Lily could almost see it, the future he was creating, a world where humans and nature were not separate, but part of the same conversation, the same story, the same impossible, beautiful truth. As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Connor stood at the window, his small hand pressed against the glass, watching the bears settle into their winter positions. His scent was contemplative, mature beyond his years, carrying notes of understanding and acceptance and something else, something that smelled like destiny accepting itself. The bears responded with their own complex fragrances, a chorus of support and recognition, acknowledging Connor not just as a curiosity or even a friend, but as something essential. A voice that spoke for all of them, a bridge that they had been waiting for perhaps for generations. In that moment, watching their son stand at the intersection of 2 worlds, Ethan and Lily understood that Connor's gift was not really his alone. It belonged to the valley, to the bears, to the forest, to everyone who would come after and learn that communication didn't require words, that understanding didn't require explanation, that connection was possible across any divide if you just knew how to speak the right language. And Connor, their beautiful, impossible son, was teaching them all how to speak it, one scent at a time, one story at a time, one miraculous day at a time. The winter deepened, and with it came revelations that continued to reshape their understanding of Connor's abilities. On particularly cold nights, when the temperature dropped well below freezing, Connor would produce warming scents that seemed to actually raise the temperature in the cabin by a few degrees. It wasn't just the perception of warmth, but actual, measurable heat, as if his scents could influence physical reality in ways that defied conventional physics. The bears, too, seemed to benefit from this ability, often gathering closer on the coldest nights, basking in the thermal bubble Connor created. During a particularly severe blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days, Connor kept everyone's spirits up with what Lily called scent stories. He would produce elaborate sequences of fragrances that told tales of summer meadows, of warm beaches they had never visited but could somehow see clearly through scent alone, of places that might not even exist except in Connor's imagination. The bears would contribute their own scent additions to these stories, creating collaborative narratives that transcended species boundaries. It was during one of these sessions that Connor produced a scent none of them had experienced before, one that smelled like starlight. If starlight had a smell, cold and bright and infinite, that scent seemed to unlock something in Connor. He began talking about things he couldn't possibly know, describing places he had never been, events that had happened before he was born. He told them about Emma, Margaret's daughter from the diary, describing her as if he had met her, saying she was still out there, somewhere in the deep forest, still learning, still growing, still bridging worlds. He spoke of others like himself, children in different parts of the world who could communicate with dolphins through bioluminescence, with birds through magnetic fields, with trees through underground root networks. He said they were all connected, all part of something larger that was waking up, remembering itself. Ethan and Lily didn't know what to make of these pronouncements. Was Connor somehow tapping into a collective consciousness? Was his gift evolving to include some form of psychic ability, or was it simply the imagination of a very unusual child? They chose to document everything without judgment, recording Connor's words and the scents that accompanied them, creating a record that might someday make sense even if it didn't now. The bears seemed to take Connor's expanded awareness in stride, responding to his impossible knowledge with their own mysterious contributions, scents that spoke of deep time and ancient memory. As Connor approached his second birthday, his physical development had caught up with his unusual abilities. He could run now, moving through the forest, with a confidence that should have terrified his parents, but somehow didn't. The bears watched over him, yes, but it was more than that. The forest itself seemed to protect him. Branches would bend out of his way, roots would flatten themselves so he wouldn't trip. Even the weather seemed to accommodate his outdoor adventures, clouds parting when he wanted to explore, rain waiting until he was safely inside. It was during one of these forest expeditions that Connor made a discovery that changed everything. He had wandered a bit farther than usual, still within sight but exploring an area they hadn't visited before, when he stopped suddenly and produced a scent of pure excitement. He had found something in the hollow of an old tree, a bundle wrapped in what looked like deerskin, preserved by some means they couldn't understand. Inside was another piece of amber, larger than the first, with what appeared to be a seed preserved inside it. But more importantly, there was a note, written in the same hand as the mysterious letter they had received months ago. The note read, "For Connor, when he is ready." This seed carries the memory of the first garden, the place where human and nature were one. Plant it when the time comes. You will know when. Until then, let it teach him what has been forgotten. The seed, amber, as they came to call it, had an immediate effect on Connor. When he held it, his sense became impossibly complex, layered with meanings that even he couldn't fully articulate. He would sit for hours, holding both pieces of amber, producing scents that made the air shimmer with those strange patterns, creating what looked like doorways to other places, other times. The bear's behavior changed after the discovery of the seed amber. They became more formal, almost ceremonial in their interactions with Connor. They would bring gifts that were clearly symbolic rather than practical. A perfectly preserved butterfly wing, a crystal that caught light in rainbow patterns, a feather from a bird none of them could identify. Each gift seemed to be part of a larger pattern, a puzzle that Connor was meant to solve. He would arrange them in specific configurations, guided by instincts he couldn't explain, creating mandalas that pulsed with meaning. One morning, Connor announced that she was coming. When asked who, he simply said, "The one who planted the first seed." They assumed he was talking about Emma, but when the visitor arrived 3 days later, it was someone entirely different. She appeared at the edge of the forest at dawn, a woman who looked both young and ancient, with eyes that held the same depth as Connor's when he was producing his most complex scents. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, and Connor walked out to meet her without hesitation, producing a greeting scent that made every flower in the vicinity bloom despite it being late winter. The woman introduced herself as Maya, though she said names were just conveniences, that she had been called many things over the years. She confirmed what Connor had been saying. There was a network of gifted children around the world, each with their own unique ability to communicate with nature. She had been traveling between them, teaching, protecting, preparing them for something she called the convergence. When pressed for details, she would only say that humanity was at a crossroads, that the old way of seeing nature as separate from human civilization was ending, and these children were the bridges to whatever came next. Maya stayed with them for a week, and during that time, Connor's abilities evolved more rapidly than they had in the previous year. She taught him techniques that seemed impossible: how to send scent messages across vast distances, how to read the health of the entire ecosystem through a single breath, how to influence weather patterns with carefully crafted fragrances. But more importantly, she taught him restraint, responsibility, the weight of having such gifts. She spoke of the temptation to use these abilities for personal gain, to control rather than communicate, to dominate rather than harmonize. Under Maya's guidance, Connor learned to sing with scents, creating symphonies of fragrance that could heal sick trees, calm aggressive animals, even influence the growth patterns of plants. She showed him how to read the scent history of objects, understanding their journey through the world by the fragrances they had absorbed. An old stone could tell the story of the glacier that carried it, the river that polished it, the hands that had touched it over centuries. It was like archaeology through smell, uncovering layers of history that were invisible to ordinary senses. But Maya also brought warnings. There were those who knew about children like Connor, who wanted to study them, use them, perhaps even eliminate them as threats to the established order. She spoke of government programs, corporate interests, scientific institutions that saw these gifts as resources to be exploited rather than miracles to be protected. She taught Ethan and Lily protection protocols, ways to shield Connor's abilities when necessary, to make him appear normal to those who might wish him harm. It was sobering, realizing that Connor's gift, as beautiful as it was, also made him vulnerable. Before she left, Maya performed a ritual with Connor and the seed amber. She had him hold it while she produced her own scents, fragrances that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The seed inside the amber began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until it was pulsing like a tiny heart. She said the seed was now activated, though she wouldn't say what that meant. She told them to trust Connor, that when the time came to plant it, he would know. And that act would change everything, though whether for better or worse depended on choices yet to be made. After Maya's departure, life returned to its version of normal, though normal for them included daily conversations with bears and a toddler who could influence reality through scent. Connor had internalized Maya's teachings, becoming more thoughtful in his use of his abilities. He began teaching his parents more deliberately, helping them develop their own latent gifts. Under his patient instruction, Lily learned to produce simple healing scents that could ease minor ailments. Ethan developed the ability to read the emotional states of animals through their scent signatures, a skill that proved useful in avoiding the occasional aggressive wildlife that wandered into their territory. The bears, too, seemed to be learning and evolving. They had begun using tools in ways bears typically didn't, manipulating objects with a dexterity that suggested their intelligence was being enhanced by prolonged exposure to Connor's gifts. One bear had learned to stack rocks in patterns that created different acoustic effects, essentially making music. Another had begun creating what could only be described as art, arranging natural materials in aesthetically pleasing ways that had no practical purpose. It was as if Connor's presence was accelerating their evolution, unlocking potentials that had always existed but never been expressed. As spring arrived once again, Connor made an announcement that surprised everyone. He said it was time to share the gift, that keeping it hidden was like keeping medicine from the sick. He wanted to help other children discover their own abilities to connect with nature. Ethan and Lily were hesitant, remembering Maya's warnings, but Connor was insistent in the way that only a 2.5-year-old could be, combining logical arguments with emotional appeals, and when those didn't work, producing scents that made resistance feel like trying to swim upstream. They compromised by starting small. Frank, ever the helpful intermediary, quietly spread word to families he trusted. Families with children who seemed different, who talked to animals or plants, who knew things they shouldn't know. One by one, these families began visiting, always discreetly, always with stories of camping trips or visiting relatives. Connor would work with the children, helping them recognize and develop their own gifts. Not all of them had scent abilities like his. Some could communicate through touch, others through sound frequencies. Humans couldn't normally hear. One girl could influence the growth of plants through humming. These gatherings became regular events. Informal schools, where children learned not just to use their gifts, but to understand their place in the larger web of life. The bears accepted these new children with the same patience they had shown Connor, though each child had their own animal allies, birds for some, deer for others, once even a family of foxes. The cabin and its surrounding forest became a sanctuary, a place where the impossible was normal, where the future of human-nature relations was being quietly written by children who didn't know they were supposed to be separate from the wild. During one of these gatherings, something extraordinary happened. All the children, 7 of them, including Connor, were playing near the stream when they suddenly stopped, all at the same moment, and looked toward the sky. Connor produced a scent that the others seemed to understand, though their parents couldn't detect it. Then, in unison, they began creating their own communications. Connor through scent, the girl through humming, another boy through patterns drawn in the dirt, each using their unique gift, but somehow harmonizing into a single message. The air shimmered, the ground vibrated slightly, and for just a moment, every animal in the forest, every bird, every insect went completely silent. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The children resumed playing as if nothing had happened. but something had changed. The parents could feel it. A shift in the atmosphere, a sense that a door had been opened that couldn't be closed again. When asked what had happened, Connor simply said they had said hello, that others like them around the world had heard, that the network Maya had spoken of was now active. It was both thrilling and terrifying, knowing that their isolated experiment in communication was part of something global, something that might reshape the very relationship between humanity and the planet. That night, Ethan and Lily sat up late discussing what this meant for their family, for Connor, for the world. They had started as parents trying to understand their unusual baby, and now they were guardians of what might be the next stage of human evolution. It was a responsibility they hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. They decided to start documenting everything more systematically, creating not just records, but teaching materials, guides for other parents who might find themselves in similar situations. They would be the chroniclers of this change, the witnesses to this quiet revolution. As they prepared for bed, Connor appeared in their doorway, holding both pieces of amber, his expression serious beyond his years. "Soon," he said. "The seed wants to grow soon. When it does, everything changes. But don't worry, it's a good change. It's what the earth has been waiting for." He padded back to his room, leaving his parents to wonder what exactly they were preparing for, what would happen when that ancient seed finally found soil. But despite the uncertainty, they felt oddly at peace. They had learned to trust the mystery, to have faith in Connor's gift, to believe that sometimes the impossible was just another word for the future arriving ahead of schedule. The summer that followed was one of preparation, though for what? Exactly, none of them could say. Connor's abilities had stabilized into something more controlled, more intentional. He could now maintain what he called scent fields, areas where his fragrances would linger and continue to have effects even after he had left. He created a healing field around a section of forest that had been damaged by disease, and over the course of weeks, the trees recovered, their bark returning to health, new growth appearing where there had been only death. The bears helped maintain these fields, their presence somehow amplifying and extending Connor's work. More families found their way to them, drawn by stories that spread despite their best efforts at secrecy. Not all the children who came had gifts, but those who did were remarkable. A boy who could feel the emotions of trees, describing their slow, patient thoughts. A girl who could see the magnetic fields that birds used to navigate, painting pictures of invisible highways in the sky. Twins who could communicate with each other through bioluminescence, their skin actually glowing with patterns that conveyed meaning. Each gift was unique, but all were variations on the same theme: connection, communication, communion with the more than human world.